My name is Tanya Verquin, host of Pixelated Perspectives podcast and the New Perspectives monthly online membership community. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be able to contribute with this short presentation in honor of Dr. Hamer and the World GNM GHK Day celebrations. For today's topic, we're going to get into the topic of migraines and understanding them from the perspective of the biological laws of nature. So before we begin, we just go through this disclaimer of the information in my presentation is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice. So if you've ever experienced migraines, it's very probable that you would have experienced one of 3 or 4 specific conflicts content. And those conflict, we'll get into the conflict content and then a personal example. And we're also going to get into, a review of the 2-phase program of each special biological program. So a common conflict or DHS experienced that will result in a migraine is a stink or scent conflict. And this is regarding the nasal mucosa, okay, the nasal mucosa here. And so anything, we can think of a stink conflict or a scent conflict as an annoyance. So something, remember, a DHS has to catch us off guard. It's got those 3 criteria. So we can't foresee it coming, right? We couldn't have seen it coming. And it's acute dramatic. So there's emotion involved and it's isolated. You feel alone in that moment. It's a split-second moment perceived by the subconscious. So a scent or stink conflict could be perceived in that moment as an annoyance, a severe annoyance, or it doesn't have to be severe, but oh my goodness, this sucks, this stinks. Or it could be like a scent conflict with a smell of danger. So in nature, animals, this is a very literal conflict for them, but for humans, for us, we can perceive this figuratively. So, I smell out danger, something dangerous is happening. And so this could be initiate a special biological program for the nasal mucosa. Another common conflict theme or conflict related to migraines that will produce a migraine is a frontal fear conflict or a powerless conflict. Now, it depends on someone's hormone status, their gender and laterality, that will determine whether one experiences a frontal fear conflict. So this means fear coming towards them, a dangerous situation coming head on or towards them, or they are moving into a very dangerous, fearful, scary situation. Again, this can be perceived as literal or figurative. Okay, a powerless conflict can be perceived as feeling that one's hands are tied, that a decision has been made over them and there's nothing they can do. They feel powerless in a sense. So these programs both are regarding and related to the pharyngeal ducts. Okay, so these ducts here, these were considered the old gills in primordial terms. So we have to think of, if someone experiences a DHS that initiates the program, the pharyngeal duct program, we have to think of what the pharyngeal ducts, their biological sense is, and that is the incoming of oxygen. Now, during the primordial seas, the time the primordial seas, the gills were to bring in oxygen from the water. But now we bring oxygen from the outside air. Okay, so this is just think of the fear coming towards you. What does one tend to do? They tend to go, and there we go. We're going to have that program initiated or potentially initiated, depending on how someone subjectively perceives that particular moment in time. Another common conflict theme is a bite conflict that would involve the enamel, so the tooth enamel. And so this is I can't bite back, or the ability to not be able to bite back. So or someone can bite back, but they're not going to. They're not allowed to bite or clench down or hold on to or snap back. So any of these three conflict content is very common when we experience, and these conflict themes are primarily controlled from the premotor sensory cortex, okay, right up front. And this is where most likely we're going to have in the healing phase, as we're going to go through later, the experience of a migraine. If we have experienced a DHS of these three conflicts, also a fourth one might be like an oral conflict in the mouth of the mucosa in the mouth. And so the ability to not get rid of something in the mouth, like spit out something, right? So all of these programs are controlled from this portion of the brain up front here. Okay, so we have to remember, as just a quick review of a DHS, we just kind of went over that, but a DHS is really that conflict shock. It's what Dr. Hamer termed a conflict shock, a Dirk Hamer syndrome. So it is the moment of a conflict shock. And at that very precise moment in time, right, that split second moment on the level of, the subconscious, all three of these, the psyche, the brain, and organ, act as one unit, one unified unit, and simultaneously are involved in that split second moment. So the conflict is perceived at the level of psyche, and in that moment, a very predetermined area in the brain is impacted with what is called a Hamer focus, so an HH, and it can be measured on a brain CT scan if one were to have a brain CT scan at the moment of an experiencing of a DHS, of a conflict shock. And at that same exact moment, not only is it impacted at the level of the brain, but also on the correspondent organ. Okay, so we talked about with these kind of conflict themes, we have the organ of the nasomucosa, of the tooth enamel, of the pharyngeal ducts, and possibly the mouth mucosa as well. So these would be the organs involved in this. So the psyche, the brain organ, these cannot be separated. They literally make up the individual. So after someone has one of those conflicts, right? They perceive a DHS and possibly one of those four different types of conflict content. There is a two-phase program that every SBS, special biological program, runs through, provided that there is a resolution to the conflict, right? So there's the very first phase, which is a conflict active phase. And then the second phase, after the conflict has been resolved, it's called the healing phase or the post-conflictolysis phase, okay, PCL phase. So let's go through these very quickly, just to reiterate the importance, and so that you'll be able to identify which of these phases you're in. And it just being able to identify allows you to read your symptoms and read what's going on within your body, your autonomic nervous system, right? So that you are able to identify what's going on. You're able to easily correlate your your situation, your symptoms, how you're feeling with the conflict. And then you can predict what the healing phase will be. And in this case, we're going to be dealing with a migraine. So let's go through this. In the conflict active phase, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system here. We move into a prolonged state of a sympathetic phase, right? It's a fight or flight phase. And so this is the moment when someone encounters that DHS, that conflict shock. What's going to happen? Well, remember, the psyche, the brain, and the organs are involved here. And so at the level of the psyche, there's going to be, obsessive thinking about that conflict. Someone's mind is just going to be completely preoccupied with that conflict, right? They can't stop thinking about it. They can't stop talking about it. They're going to have sleep disturbances because of it. And the whole purpose of that is, the brain is saying, hey, let's figure out, you need to stay awake to figure out a solution to this conflict. So we are going to have a lack of appetite in this phase as well. This is not the time where our bodies are like, oh, let's just go ahead and fill up. We're going to be able to digest. No, this is where, all things are running. The engines are running. Your body is full on, and that's the whole purpose of doing what you need to do to either survive and cope or resolve the conflict at hand. The blood vessels are going to constrict, causing cold extremities. So your hands and feet are going to be cold in this phase. You were going to have elevated blood pressure. This is absolutely normal in a conflict active phase. And remember, all of these, things that happen within the body physiologically is going to be proportionate in intensity and degree in which your psyche perceive that conflict. Okay, so if it was a very severe, intense perceived conflict, DHS, well, then these physiological adaptations are going to be just as intense. Okay. At the level of the brain, we're going to have that again, that impact on the brain. So we're going to be able to see if someone were to have a CT scan, the impact at the level of the brain, precisely up here in this area for these conflict themes. And then we're going to have tissue adaptation to that, depending on where the hammer focus is within the brain, the, the corresponding organ relay. And so this is what's going to be happening. You just got a little graph here to show you. Obviously, these percentages aren't like this for everybody. It just gives you an idea of all the things that are going on within your being, within you as an individual when you move into a conflict active phase. Okay, we got all these things happening, and it's all in the color of blue to let you know this is kind of the cold phase. So just keep in mind, recognize when you're in this state, this phase, this sympathetic phase, so that you're empowered to resolve the conflict if possible, right? This is our ultimate goal, is to biologically resolve this conflict or at least to downgrade it. Okay. In the healing phase, we have a different story. So this is the turning point where the conflict has been resolved. And so instead of being in that prolonged state of sympathetic phase, right, fight or flight, we now move into the healing phase. And this is a vagatonic phase. So this is the rest and digest phase. So now the psyche will have relief. You're not going to be, obsessively talking and stressing over the conflict anymore. The psyche feels relief, and you are going to be able to sleep now. You're going to feel tired. The return of appetite comes back, and this is where your body is in the position now to digest, to actually work for you, digest, assimilate, gather the nutrients from what you're providing it through food. The blood vessels are going to dilate again, giving you warm extremities. So this is known also as the warm phase, hence the colors of the pinks and reds here on the graph. So whatever tissue adaptation happened in the conflict active phase, so let's say we were dealing with the nasal mucosa, someone had an annoyance conflict, well, there would have been ulceration in the nasal mucosa in order to widen the passage that we can breathe in more oxygen, better smell the situation, and it puts us into a better position, right? A better position to resolve the conflict. So with that ulceration, that tissue loss in the conflict active phase, well, now this is the phase where those tissues are now replenished and restored. And this is what causes the symptoms. We also have at that level of the organ, as well as in the head, at that hammer focus, we have what's called an edema. And this is just a pocket of water that accumulates in those two areas to help protect those areas while the tissue is being replenished and restored. Healing always happens in that liquid environment, and that's very important. But that too is what causes that congestion, right? It causes that running noses, the having to sneeze, the blowing of the nose. So this is where we get the symptoms due to the inflammation and oftentimes pain and fever. And when we're talking about migraines, this is the point where migraines comes into play, and specifically during the epicrisis. So migraines occur in the healing phase, in this healing phase we just talked about, but specifically the most intense during the epicrisis phase. Now, what is this phase? Well, let's just take a look here. So here is a graph, what Dr. Hamer created. was this conflict phase, was the blue phase, right? The cold phase, that's sympathetic. And then it's resolved, the conflict, and we move into this the warm phase or the healing phase. And you can see here, it's an eptiloid crisis. This is known as an epicrisis. So this is the height of the healing phase. Right in the middle of the healing phase, your body will naturally push you back into a very short amount of time into this conflict active phase to cause pressure to release that edema from the brain and the correspondent organ involved and tissues involved. And so, in order to get that pressure to squeeze out, it has to put it back into a sympathetic phase where all of a sudden the engines are all running again. And that's just a short period of time, but that's the moment and the time, the duration of when that migraine is most intense. After that epicrisis phase, then you move back down into that vagatonic phase and the edema is gone. So there's no more congestion. There's no more pressure there in the head because of the edema. But now it's just kind of sharp pain left over. And that's the remnants of the migraine. So this is that two-phase program looking at it from Dr. Hamer's diagram. Okay. So as an example, just to kind of show you what, a type of conflict that I experienced not too long ago, maybe a month or two ago, I was driving with my husband. We were driving through um, the Jasper National Park. It's not far from where we live, but we have been driving for several hours to make it back home. And we were about an hour home. And, up until that hour, we had a lovely drive. We weren't in a hurry. We weren't making, we weren't feeling the rush to pass people. We just were taking our time, enjoying the beautiful scenery. And then about an hour away from home, my husband just decided it was time to get home. And he was all of a sudden in a rush. Now, probably he was, triggered into a constellation at that point where his behavior changes. And this is absolutely normal. This is what happens to so many of us when there's all of a sudden a difference in behavior. And that's a whole another conversation that we're not going to get into in this one. But to just highlight my example, he in that moment needed to get home. It was just like, okay, it's enough. We're almost there, right at the end. So he just started to speed up in our vehicle. And he started making these passes, passing towards oncoming via traffic, right? It's just a two-way lane. So you've got, one lane is for oncoming traffic and one lane is for us. And so he would make these passes that, normally he's a wonderful driver. And I never ever have worried with his passing. I mean, he would pass, and this is probably very typical for men, just because their brains are wired. They're able to um, perform very well with moving objects, right? And they can sense the distance way better than a woman can with how our brains are wired. And and so for him, he's making these passes that he feels completely satisfied and safe with. But for me, it was a different story. I experienced very, very scary moments where I didn't think we were going to make that pass before getting hit by these oncoming vehicles. And so during this hour home, I experienced frontal fear complex, probably, one or two experiences where it was insane, intensely scary for me. And you can see how this is it was perceived literally in my mind that it's danger is coming. We are moving head on towards oncoming traffic. And so it was a literal frontal fear conflict. And so this is what ultimately resulted in a migraine for me after we got home. So when we're home, we're home safe, we're parked, we're in the house, the conflict's resolved. There's no scariness, no danger anymore in the situation. And so there we go. That's a resolution to the conflict. And what did I experience shortly after? Yes, a migraine. And so it was not surprising in the least because I had known as soon as I felt the onset of that headache, that pressure building, then I was able to easily ask that question. Well, what was it that I just experienced? What was that fear? And of course, it was a no-brainer. Yes, that hour drive home was intensely scary for me. And so it was okay. So being able to connect make the more emotional correlation to the conflict and your symptoms helps so much because it takes the fear out. You're not worried that something's gone wrong. We know that, nature and our bodies, there's no mistakes. Everything's very meaningful and it has a purpose. And so the migraine here was just the healing phase of this short-lived frontal fear conflict. And so my migraine was short-lived too. So this is that was just a personal example I wanted to share with you, just to give you a sense of what can happen, like a literal conflict like that. So really, Dr. Hamer used to say knowledge is the therapy because people are often wondering, well, so we know this. Yes, we can correlate our symptoms with a conflict, but then what? Well, that really is the therapy because, again, looking back at the two phases, when you can understand what phase you are in, and let's say you're in a conflict active phase, it is our responsibility to downgrade the conflict if we cannot resolve it in that moment. So for me in the vehicle, I knew this was scary. I didn't necessarily know I experienced a frontal fear conflict, but I knew I was in a conflict active phase because I had cold hands, my feet were cold. I was just like, my heart rate was up. I was not relaxed. There was no way I wanted to snack on our snacks or anything. I was just like, oh my gosh, just complete high alert. So it's up to me in that moment to become aware of that and downgrade it. Like, understand, tell myself, your husband is a wonderful driver. You know, he's better at this. He's better at judging distance than I am. And he would never put us both in a position that would endanger us. That's just not who he is. So just being able to talk myself into being able to downgrade that conflict for me and to help myself feel better, that's my responsibility. And so this is why knowing and looking for the indications of a conflict active phase is going to be so helpful because we know the tissue adaptation is proportionate in degree and intensity as that conflict was perceived. So the more I can downgrade it, the quicker it can be resolved, the least amount of tissue adaptation is going to be happening on the level of the organ, which means the less and the kind of the least amount of symptoms you're going to have to go through in the healing phase. So again, resolve the conflict. This is the therapy. Downgrade the conflict, the therapy. Ice pack. So when the headache comes on, we keep freezer full of ice packs. This is just handy to have. Put the ice packs on the head because in that first phase of the healing phase where you have the edema, that water accumulation, that's going to cause inflammation. So by helping keep the ice there, it's going to reduce that inflammation a little bit. And then laying down with your head a little bit elevated just to keep the blood pressure from pumping there right up into the brain. And also another amazing thing for therapy is having a pack, having somebody or some people, whether it's family members, loved ones, friends, or a community, to be able to lean on and ask for help so that you don't feel alone in your symptoms. You don't feel like you can't manage because we all have busy lives, we all have responsibilities, and sometimes it's common that we don't allow ourselves to just rest and heal what needs to be healed, or allow our bodies to go through these healing phases. We always think we have to keep up with the responsibilities. But if we know we are not alone and we have people to lean on and ask for help, this is a huge, huge benefit. We can use homeopathy in these situations with migraines and any symptoms what is that helpful homeopathic remedy that can assist our bodies while moving through this healing phase without stopping it, without interrupting it. And of course, soothing topical essential oils is helpful. The peppermint essential oil, I often have a rub on, right? You can just roll it on, and that cools the surface, and it kind of just helps the pain. And then you can listen to Dr. Hamer's healing melody, the Mayan Student Native Chin. This is it's available on Amiki. Actually, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. We'll leave that in the show notes. But this is Dr. Hamer's healing melody that is tuned in different frequencies that support the body as you're moving through these two phase patterns. And then, of course, we want to avoid returning and reoccurring symptoms of any kind, especially migraines. Well, not especially, but also migraines. And this we can do by avoiding the tracks. So becoming aware of tracks if there are tracks. So if you're somebody who deals with recurring migraines, well, let's start understanding what the tracks are, understanding how tracks are established in the first place, and that again is a different topic, but very much related and important to understand. And and then to avoid those tracks, or to use Danny Carroll's system of the bio switch, where you learn to communicate with your subconscious mind to switch off the track, switch off the program that is directly related to a conflict that continues this ongoing perpetual states of symptoms. In this case, it could be migraines. So I hope this was helpful. This was a quick example and an explanation of why someone experiences migraines and the very common conflict content related to this. Thank you so much for your time and for watching and listening. If you have any questions, please do reach out and let us know.